The air over Henrico County in July of 1861 did not merely sit. It pressed down with a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of humidity that trapped the scent of curing tobacco, damp earth, and the sharp, resinous tang of pine needles baking in the Virginia heat. It was a summer defined by an uneasy stillness, the kind of atmospheric tension that precedes a violent storm, mirroring the fracture of a nation that had just begun to bleed. On the Mulberry Creek plantation, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised hues of purple and charcoal, the shadows of the ancient oak trees stretched across the slave quarters like grasping fingers. The usual evening sounds, the low murmur of exhaustion, the clanking of iron pots, the distant barking of hounds, were dampened this night by a heavy conspiratorial silence near the cabin of old Nancy. A small circle of men and women, their faces etched with the deep lines of labor and sorrow, gathered around the flickering light of a single grease lamp. The flame danced nervously in the stagnant air, casting long, wavering shadows against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. Their attention was not on the meager meal before them, but on several scraps of yellowed, coarse paper spread out on the dirt floor. The paper, likely scavenged from the trash heap of the main house or traded for in secret, bore markings that defied the logic of their world. Drawn with a piece of burnt charcoal, the lines were not the idle doodles of a child, but precise geometric configurations, webs of tension and compression, wheels within wheels, and rigid wings that mimicked no bird known to God's creation. Elijah sat at the edge of the light, his 17-year-old frame thin and angular, his knees pulled to his chest. He did not look like a prophet. He looked like a boy starving for something other than food. His hands, stained black with soot and dust, rested idly on his shins, while his eyes, dark and unsettlingly calm, stared into the middle distance. He spoke of the drawings not as inventions, but as memories of things he had not yet touched. He described the machine on the paper, a mechanical hawk of iron and canvas that required no horse to pull it and no wind to lift it, with a detached, monotone voice, claiming the images came to him in the space between waking and sleeping, forcing their way into his mind until his fingers ached to release them. Beside him, his mother, Clara, sat rigid on a low stool. Her hands were white-knuckled as they gripped a tattered, leather-bound Bible against her chest, the leather worn smooth by years of desperate prayer. Her face was a landscape of conflict. There was the fierce, protective love of a mother, marred by a creeping, cold dread. In the plantation ecosystem, to be different was to be a target. To possess a mind that wandered beyond the cotton rows was to invite the whip, or worse, the auction block. But this was different. This was dangerous in a way that felt spiritual, almost heretical. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. One of the older field hands, a man named Thomas, whose back bore the map of his history, pointed a trembling finger at the drawing of the mechanical bird. His voice was barely a whisper, thick with fear. He recounted a fragment of conversation he had overheard near the overseer's porch only 2 days prior, a reading from a Richmond newspaper about the Union Army employing strange, floating observation devices, balloons of silk and gas, technology that seemed alien to the agrarian South. How could Elijah, a boy who had never traveled past the county line, who could not read the white man's papers, sketch the skeleton of a machine that the world was only just beginning to whisper about? The drawing on the dirt floor was not a crude balloon, but something sharper, faster, more evolved. It was an anomaly that chilled the blood despite the heat of the night. The skepticism that usually guarded their hearts against false hope was eroding, replaced by a terrifying wonder. In the dim light, the charcoal lines seemed to vibrate with a latent energy, and the silence that followed was not one of peace, but of a collective holding of breath, waiting for a hammer to fall. Welcome to Slavery Stories, a digital sanctuary where we descend into the shadowed archives of the American past to illuminate the narratives that history has often left to rot in the dark. We are not here to simply recite the roster of atrocities or to retread the familiar paths of the textbooks. We are here to touch the rough-hewn texture of reality, to smell the dust of forgotten ledgers, and to listen to the voices that have been silenced by the heavy curtain of time. This story, the chronicle of a boy named Elijah, is not merely a recounting of pain and injustice, though the scars of the lash and the weight of the chains are woven into its very fabric. It is a story that defies the rigid architecture of our understanding, a narrative that challenges the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. It is not a standard account of insurrection, nor a map of the Underground Railroad's hidden paths. It is an examination of a profound human phenomenon that bloomed in the most hostile of soils, a testament to a mind that served as a bridge between the agrarian stagnation of the 19th century and the mechanical roar of a future not yet born. Before we step fully into the humid, pine-scented air of 1860s Virginia, we ask you to join our community. Subscribe to the channel so that no chapter of this intricate saga slips through your fingers. Press the like button if you value the excavation of these unique, often unsettling archives, and lend your voice to the discussion in the comments below. We must ask ourselves, is it possible that some souls were so pure, or their spirits so unbreakable, that they could touch spheres of knowledge completely alien to their time? Could the trauma of the plantation crack open a door to the unknown? Today, we begin to unravel the tapestry of Elijah's life. We transport ourselves to the Mulberry Creek Plantation in Henrico County, a place defined by the oppressive heat that rose from the red clay and shimmering waves, and the relentless, deafening chorus of cicadas that provided the soundtrack to a life of servitude. Here, amidst the smell of drying tobacco and the sharp tang of sweat, lived a boy whose existence was a paradox. Elijah possessed a gift, or perhaps a curse, that allowed him to see the future. But he didn't see it in vague prophecies or spiritual metaphors. He saw it in gears, in steam, in the cold precision of metal and the hum of electricity, long before such things had names in his world. This burden shaped his destiny before he ever drew his first breath of the thick, humid air of the South. His coming was not quiet. His birth, shrouded in the heavy mists of a February morning and surrounded by the hushed whispers of the enslaved community, was marked by omens that the elders claimed were written in the very sky. It was a beginning that foretold a life that would never, could never, be ordinary. The February wind of 1844 did not merely blow through Henrico County. It scoured the land, rattling the skeletal branches of the oak trees that stood sentinel over the Mulberry Creek Plantation. Inside the slave quarters, the cold was a physical weight, pressing against the mud and straw chinking of the log cabins. In one such structure, barely 12 feet by 12, the air was thick with the cloying heat of a wood stove, pushed to its limit, and the acrid animal scent of a burning grease lamp. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn timber walls, turning the knots in the wood into watching eyes. Here, on a pallet stuffed with corn shucks and covered in coarse wool, Clara fought a battle as old as humanity itself. She was young, her face etched with a premature exhaustion that spoke of sun-up to sundown labor in the tobacco fields. But tonight, her pain was specific, sharp, and terrifying. She had walked this valley twice before, only to leave her infants in the cold, red clay of the plantation burial ground, victims of fever and malnutrition. Silence was her only defense. She bit down on a leather strap to stifle her cries, for a noisy birth could draw the ire of the overseers, or worse, the attention of Mr. Thorne himself. Old Nancy sat at the foot of the pallet, her presence as grounding as the earth floor beneath them. Her hands, gnarled like the roots of the cypress trees in the swamp, and calloused from 60 years of picking and scrubbing, moved with a tenderness that belied their strength. Nancy was more than a midwife. She was the keeper of the community's history and its secrets. A woman who read the signs in the flight of crows and the texture of the soil. The cabin smelled of sage and boiled water, a meager attempt to sterilize a world defined by dirt and disease. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded beast, masking the shallow, ragged gasps escaping Clara's lips. When the moment of arrival finally came, it was not accompanied by the usual cacophony of life. The child slipped into the world in a profound, unsettling silence. There was no sharp intake of breath, no indignant wail to announce his presence to the misery awaiting him. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, causing Clara to lift her head in panic, her eyes wide with the anticipation of another tragedy. Nancy, acting on instinct honed by decades of deliveries, leaned in to clear the child's airway, but she froze. The boy lay in her hands, slick with the vernix of birth, yet he was not limp. His chest rose and fell with a calm, rhythmic cadence that seemed entirely out of place for a newborn. But it was his eyes that arrested her soul. They were wide open. In the dim, amber light of the grease lamp, they did not wander aimlessly or squint against the sudden brightness. Instead, they were dark, absorbing pools that fixed upon the flame with a terrifying intensity, as if analyzing the very nature of the fire. As Nancy began to wipe him clean with a rough cloth, a sensation unlike anything she had ever felt washed over her. It was a coldness, not the physical chill of a winter draft, but a psychic drop in temperature that made the hair on her arms stand on end. It radiated from the infant, a strange, static charge that hummed against her fingertips. She turned his small hands over to check his fingers, a routine inspection, and her breath hitched in her throat. The lines on the boy's palms did not curve in the soft, organic arcs of life and heart and head that she had seen on 1,000 other hands. These lines were sharp. They cut across his skin in precise geometric angles, intersecting to form triangles and grids. To Nancy's superstitious mind, they looked like the structural beams of a bridge or the rigid iron tracks of the railroad, things of metal and industry, not of flesh and blood. The symmetry was unnatural, a blueprint stamped into the skin of a slave child. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She remembered the whispered stories of her grandmother, tales of souls that traveled from the stars, bringing with them knowledge that could build empires or destroy them. This child was marked. Nancy wrapped him tightly in the swaddling clothes, hiding those strange, architecturally perfect hands from the world. She leaned close to Clara, her voice trembling not with age, but with a profound, instinctive fear. "This boy," she whispered, the words barely audible over the crackling fire. "He is not silent because he cannot speak. He is silent because he is listening to things we cannot hear. Clara, you must guard him. Hide his hands. Hide his mind. For he carries a burden that this world is not ready to see." By the time Elijah reached his 5th winter, the difference between him and the other children of the quarter had become a chasm that no amount of motherly love could bridge. While the other boys chased makeshift balls of rag and twine, kicking up the red dust of the yard in fits of laughter, Elijah remained an island of stillness. He did not run. He observed. His playground was not the open yard, but the periphery of the plantation's mechanics, the rhythmic creaking of the water wheel at the creek, the grinding iron axles of the heavy wagons, and the fulcrum of the well sweep. He would stand for hours, his small, calloused hands hanging limp at his sides, his eyes tracking the transfer of motion from wood to iron, dissecting the physics of the world around him with a gaze that felt unnervingly adult. Clara often found him squatting in the shade of the grand oak tree that bordered the slave quarters, a sharpened stick in his hand. But where other children might scratch crude figures of dogs or people into the earth, Elijah's stick carved a language of geometry. The Virginia red clay, usually unforgiving and hard-packed by the July heat, became a canvas for circles within circles, interlocking teeth of gears that did not yet exist, and lever systems that defied the simple tools known to the plantation. These were not doodles, they were schematics. The lines were drawn with a terrifying precision, the angles exact, suggesting a mind that perceived the world not as it was, but as a series of interlocking forces waiting to be harnessed. When the wind blew the dust across his work, he did not cry. He simply smoothed the earth and began a new iteration, as if the drawing was merely a way to purge the image from his mind. The true depth of this anomaly revealed itself on a humid afternoon in 1849. Clara, searching for kindling, tracked her son to the abandoned curing barn on the edge of the property, a structure smelling of rotted timber and the ghostly, sweet scent of old tobacco. The air inside was stagnant, sliced only by beams of dust motes, dancing in the shafts of sunlight piercing through the warped siding. There, in the center of the gloom, sat Elijah. He had scavenged the refuse of the plantation, rusted nails, a broken shear blade, scraps of hickory, and lengths of stolen twine. From this debris, he had constructed a device that defied explanation. It was a chaotic assembly of counterweights and rotors, roughly the size of a melon, suspended from a rafter by a fraying rope. As Clara watched, paralyzed by a sudden chill, Elijah gave the device a gentle push. It did not merely swing, it spun. The wooden gears, whittled with a stolen kitchen knife, meshed with a fluidity that should have been impossible for such crude materials. The device rotated with a hypnotic, self-sustaining momentum, emitting a low, rhythmic hum, a vibration that seemed to resonate against the damp wood of the barn walls. It sounded like a trapped insect, or perhaps a machine breathing. There was no joy in Elijah's face as he watched it spin, only a solemn, critical evaluation. He was not playing, he was testing. Old Nancy, the midwife who had brought him into the world, stepped out from the shadows behind Clara, startling her. The old woman's face, a map of deep wrinkles etched by decades of survival, was twisted in a grimace that sat somewhere between awe and terror. She gripped Clara's arm with a strength that belied her age, her fingernails digging into the flesh. "You see it, don't you?" Nancy whispered, her voice trembling like dry leaves. "This ain't child's play, Clara. This is the work of a mind that has touched the other side." She gestured to the humming machine, which continued its impossible rotation. If the overseer sees this, if Master Thorne sees a boy who can make dead wood sing and iron move without a horse, they will not call it genius. They will call it conjuring. They will call it a threat. A slave who understands the mechanics of power is a slave they have to break. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The humming of the machine suddenly sounded like a siren. In the brutal economy of the plantation, intelligence was a commodity only when it served the master. When it surpassed the master, it became a capital offense. She rushed forward, her heart hammering against her ribs, and dismantled the device. She pulled the gears apart, snapping the twine, scattering the carefully balanced weights into the straw. Elijah did not protest. He simply watched the destruction of his work with those ancient, knowing eyes, as if he had already anticipated the loss. Clara gathered the pieces, her hands shaking, realizing that the drawings in the dirt and the machines in the barn were not gifts to be nurtured, but dangerous secrets to be buried. She was holding evidence of a mind that was out of time, and in 1850s Virginia, being ahead of your time was a sure way to run out of it. By the summer of 1852, the air over Henrico County hung with a suffocating weight, thick with the yellow haze of pine pollen and the relentless, sawing drone of cicadas that seemed to vibrate in the very teeth of those who worked the land. Elijah was 8 years old now, his frame slight but wiry, his hands already hardened by labor that no child should have known. The incident that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his life occurred not in the fields, but in the shadow of the curing shed, where the smell of hickory smoke and old salt permanently stained the wood. He had been tasked with rolling empty molasses barrels, their staves swollen with humidity. In a moment of sharp violence, a rusted steel hoop, fatigued by years of tension, snapped with the sound of a pistol crack. The jagged metal whipped outward, slicing deep into the calf of the boy's leg, laying open the flesh to the bone. The blood that pooled in the red Virginia clay was dark and immediate, mixing with the dust to form a grim mortar. Mr. Silas Thorne, the master of Mulberry Creek, viewed the injury not as a tragedy, but as a depreciation of assets. Fearing infection would claim a future field hand, he dispatched a rider to Richmond. Hours later, a carriage arrived carrying Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was a man of the new century, smelling of pipe tobacco, dried lavender, and the sharp, chemical bite of carbolic acid. He was a man of science in a landscape dominated by superstition and the whip, known for his fascination with the mechanical workings of both the human body and the industrial engines beginning to reshape the North. As Finch set to work on the dusty ground of the courtyard, cleaning the jagged wound with stinging spirits, Elijah did not scream. He did not cry out for his mother, Clara, who had been ordered to stay back near the laundry kettles. Instead, the boy retreated inward. His eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on the ground. While the doctor's needle pierced his skin, stitching the torn muscle, Elijah's hand found a dry oak twig. He began to draw. He did not draw the pain. He drew to escape it. The scratching of the twig against the hard-packed earth created a rhythmic counterpoint to the doctor's labored breathing. Slowly, a design emerged from the dust. It was not the crude scribbling of a child mimicking a flower or a dog. It was a study in geometry and tension. Perfect concentric circles intersected with sharp, angular levers. Finch, tying off the final suture, wiped his bloody hands on a rag and looked down, intending to offer a word of comfort. The words died in his throat. What lay in the dirt was a schematic of impossible precision. It resembled the inner workings of a clock, yet the escapement mechanism was wrong, or rather, it was evolved. It featured a series of rotary pistons that would not appear in engineering journals for another 60 years. The drawing suggested a method of propulsion that relied on compression, a concept alien to the steam-driven world of 1852. Finch adjusted his spectacles, the glass catching the glare of the afternoon sun. He ignored the heat radiating from the ground. "What is this, boy?" he asked, his voice low, stripped of the usual condescension reserved for slaves. Elijah did not look up. He continued to shade a section of the diagram, indicating depth and density with cross-hatching that bespoke an innate understanding of drafting. "I see it," Elijah whispered, his voice raspy from the shock of the injury. "The inside, how it turns without the wind." Silas Thorne, standing over them with his arms crossed, wiped sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. He glanced at the dirt and scoffed, seeing only nonsense. "The boy's a dreamer, Alistair, always staring at nothing. Just finish up so he can heal." Thorne saw a broken tool. Finch saw a miracle wrapped in a mystery. The doctor reached into his coat pocket, retrieving a leather-bound journal and a graphite pencil. With trembling hands, he began to copy the design from the dirt, trying desperately to capture the logic of the gears before the wind or a careless boot erased them forever. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fever of the day. He was looking at an anatomy of a machine that had not yet been born, sketched by a child who had never seen a textbook. It was a discovery that pricked at his vanity and his curiosity, a dangerous seed planted in the fertile soil of his intellect, destined to grow into an obsession that would strip away the boy's remaining anonymity. Dr. Finch's curiosity, once piqued, did not wane. Months later, he returned to Mulberry Creek Plantation, this time without an official medical summons. He sought out Mr. Silas Thorne, the plantation owner, requesting permission to study the abilities of young Elijah. Thorne, ever pragmatic, saw potential profit in a peculiar enslaved boy. He imagined Elijah might foresee bountiful harvests or locate hidden water sources, a notion that brought a faint, avaricious glint to his eyes. He granted Finch's request, envisioning a slave whose unusual gift could add to his wealth. However, Dr. Finch's true intentions lay elsewhere, far beyond agricultural predictions. He began a series of intense, almost clinical sessions with Elijah. The boy was taken from the sun-drenched, dusty fields, his skin still carrying the warmth of the sun and the scent of earth, and led into a small, sparsely furnished room within the main house. The air here was cooler, cleaner, yet it felt heavy with an unspoken tension, a stark contrast to the open expanse he was accustomed to. For hours, Elijah would sit, a piece of paper before him, under the doctor's unblinking, scrutinizing gaze. Finch presented him with intricate diagrams of contemporary mechanisms, the blueprints of steam engines, their gears and pistons a marvel of the age. He would press Elijah, urging him to complete them, to see their future iterations. But Elijah did not merely elaborate on the given designs. What flowed from his charcoal-stained fingers onto the rough paper were not extensions of Finch's world, but manifestations of his own vivid, often overwhelming visions. The room, filled with the faint scent of old paper and the scratching sound of charcoal, became a window to a future he could not comprehend, but was forced to articulate. He drew flying machines, their wings unlike any birds, soaring through unseen skies. He sketched submarines, sleek metal beasts navigating the depths, and complex communication devices that hummed with invisible currents. Each drawing was a torment, a vivid, often painful, download from a distant time. A permanent shadow of exhaustion and fear settled upon his young face, etching lines around his eyes that spoke of burdens far too heavy for a boy of his years. During one such session, the air thick with unspoken tension, Elijah produced a drawing that caused Dr. Finch to recoil. With chilling precision, he rendered a detailed ballistic trajectory and the intricate schematics of an explosive device. The drawing was hauntingly similar to the advanced ordnance that would later be deployed with devastating effect during the Siege of Petersburg. When Finch's eyes finally comprehended the implications of the drawing, his face drained of all color. He understood, with a sickening certainty, that this was no mere flight of fancy, no child's vivid imagination. This was something far deeper, far more dangerous, a glimpse into a future that promised unimaginable destruction. Unbeknownst to Finch, Mr. Thorne had been lurking near the open door, his ear pressed against the frame. He had overheard fragments of their hushed conversation, his eyes catching glimpses of Elijah's unsettling diagrams. The planter, a man whose world was defined by the tangible and the controllable, concluded that the boy was either possessed by malevolent spirits, or perhaps even worse, a dangerous anomaly that threatened the perceived order of his domain. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in Thorne's gut. He did not hesitate. He ordered Elijah to be immediately isolated, dragged from the main house, and locked away in a remote, windowless storeroom, its air thick with the smell of damp earth and forgotten things. The official pretense was treatment for an evil spirit, a convenient justification. But the true intent was clear: to ensure that no one else would ever witness Elijah's prophetic drawings. This brutal act marked the first true breaking point for Elijah, shattering the fragile remnants of his childhood innocence. His extraordinary gift, once a source of wonder and quiet fascination, was now irrevocably transformed into a crushing curse, trapping him within the terrifying confines of his own inescapable visions. The heavy wooden door, creaking shut, echoed the finality of his new, grim reality. The confinement within the root cellar was not merely an imprisonment of the body. It was an immersion into a crowded, screaming void where the laws of the physical world seemed to dissolve. The air inside the small, windowless structure hung heavy, a stagnant cocktail of wet earth, curing salt, and the acrid memory of wood smoke that had seeped into the timber over decades. For Elijah, the darkness was not an absence of light, but a canvas upon which the burning phosphorescence of his mind projected images of terrifying clarity. Stripped of the paper and graphite that had been his tether to sanity, he found himself clawing at the rough-hewn walls, his fingernails packed with the grit of limestone and rot. In the corner, amidst the debris of neglect, he salvaged pieces of cold, charred wood, remnants of a long-extinguished fire, and began to write his visions upon the very cage that held him. He no longer sketched the mechanical birds or the iron horses that had so frightened Dr. Finch. Those were solid, tangible things. What consumed him now in the damp silence were the forces that moved them, the invisible blood of a future century. With manic, trembling strokes, he covered the peeling plaster with sweeping, abstract curves that resembled the flow of water or the invisible currents of wind, yet possessed a geometric precision that defied the crudeness of his tools. The charcoal crumbled in his grip, dusting his hands in a permanent shadow as he mapped out magnetic fields and the oscillation of waves that no eye in 1861 could perceive. He became a ghost in his own life, his body wasting away, the hollows of his cheeks deepening as he refused the meager rations pushed through the slot, his appetite suppressed by the relentless, electrical humming that vibrated behind his eyes. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the Virginia pines and the cicadas began their shrill chorus, the heavy silence of the cellar would be broken by a sound that tore at what remained of his human heart. It was the soft, rhythmic scuff of leather against packed dirt, his mother's pacing. Clara would stand on the other side of the thick oak door, her presence betrayed by the low, mournful hum of a spiritual she was too afraid to sing aloud. He could hear the press of her forehead against the wood, her stifled sobs vibrating through the grain. Elijah would open his mouth to call out, to tell her he was still there, but his voice had atrophied, replaced by a torrent of equations and shapes that clogged his throat. He stood paralyzed in the dark, his hand hovering inches from the door, unable to bridge the gap between his terrifying internal reality and the sorrow of the woman who loved him. Then came the night the sky broke open over Henrico County. It began not with rain, but with a sudden, oppressive drop in pressure that made the air in the cellar feel thick as water. The smell of ozone, sharp, metallic, and electric, permeated the cracks in the foundation long before the first thunderclap rattled the shelves. As the storm unleashed its fury, turning the plantation yard into a quagmire of mud and anxiety, Elijah fell to the earthen floor. His body seized, resonating with the atmospheric charge building above. He did not cower. Instead, he began to dig his fingers into the damp clay of the floor, dragging lines through the dirt with a feverish intensity. He was not drawing a machine, he was drawing a web. He connected points in the mud, Richmond, Washington, New York, linking them with jagged, branching arteries of power. It was a crude, primitive map of an electrical grid, a nervous system for a nation not yet born. As the lightning flashed, illuminating the cellar through the cracks in the boards with strobe-like violence, Elijah whispered into the dirt. The words were not English, nor the dialect of the quarters, but a fragmented recitation of volts, currents, and resistance, a technical liturgy for a god of copper and light that had yet to descend to earth. The whispers surrounding the so-called possessed boy of Mulberry Creek could no longer be contained within the stifling heat of the slave quarters. They seeped into the parlors of Henrico County, carried by the humid Virginia breeze, speaking of a darkness that defied the natural order. For Mr. Silas Thorne, these rumors were more than a mere nuisance. They were a direct threat to the market value of his estate and his standing among the Southern gentry. Desperate to excise this blemish before it could fester further, he summoned the Reverend Elijah Albright of the Providence Baptist Church, a man whose sermons on spiritual warfare were as rigid and unyielding as the iron gates of Richmond. Albright arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, his carriage kicking up clouds of red dust that settled heavily on the wilting magnolia leaves lining the drive. He was a towering figure, clad in severe black broadcloth that seemed to absorb the relentless sun, his face carved from granite conviction. Behind him trailed a small retinue of parishioners, clutching their prayer books like shields against an unseen enemy, their eyes darting nervously toward the shadowed corners of the plantation. Thorne led the solemn procession to the isolated storehouse at the furthest edge of the property. The air here was stagnant, heavy with the scent of wet rot, mildew, and the metallic tang of fear. As the heavy wooden bar was lifted from the door, the iron hinges screamed in protest, revealing a gloom so absolute it seemed to swallow the light from their kerosene lanterns. Inside, huddled in the corner on a bed of damp, matted straw, sat the boy. Elijah was a shadow of his former self, his frame wasted away to sharp angles and taut skin, yet his eyes, wide, unblinking, and terrifyingly lucid, stared not at the men who had entered, but through them. His hands, caked in the filth of his confinement, moved rhythmically in the empty air, tracing complex, invisible geometries that only he could perceive. The sound of rats skittering in the walls was the only accompaniment to his silent orchestration. The Reverend stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his substantial weight. He opened his leather-bound Bible, the pages rustling like dry leaves in a dead forest, and began to recite Psalm 91. His voice boomed within the confined space, a hammer meant to shatter the silence. "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day." But the boy did not flinch. Instead, the rhythmic motion of his hands accelerated, his fingers twitching as if manipulating unseen levers. Elijah's lips, cracked and dry, parted to release a voice that sounded like grinding stones, raspy, unused, yet chillingly precise. He cut through the scripture not with blasphemy, but with a description of a machine that would not exist for another century. "It is a long throat of iron," Elijah whispered, his gaze fixed on a point in the dust motes dancing in the lantern light. "Wrapped in coils of copper snakes, it spits fire without powder. No smoke, only the hum of the lightning trapped in the metal." He was describing, with unnerving accuracy, the mechanics of a kinetic bombardment weapon, a railgun, articulating the principles of electromagnetic acceleration with the vocabulary of a plantation slave. The parishioners took a collective step back, the hair on their arms standing on end, not from the cold, but from a sudden, static charge that seemed to fill the air. Elijah slowly raised a trembling finger, pointing directly at the Reverend's chest. "You speak of spirits, preacher," he rasped, his voice gaining a strange, resonant authority that belied his frail body. "But you do not see the true power that will bind this world. It is already here, in the air, in the metal, in every wire that has not yet been spun." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the heavy, panicked breathing of the men. Reverend Albright, a man who had faced down cholera outbreaks and slave insurrections with stoic resolve, turned the color of old parchment. He saw in the boy's eyes not the chaos of madness, but a terrifying, cold order, a logic that belonged to a God he did not recognize. He slammed his Bible shut, the sound like a pistol shot in the cramped room, and backed away, his boots scraping frantically against the dirt floor. To him, this was no mere lunacy. It was a revelation of a future so alien, so devoid of the natural laws he understood, that it could only be the work of the devil himself. The spectacle orchestrated by Silas Thorne was intended to be a restoration of order, a public cleansing of the unnatural blight that had settled over Mulberry Creek like a thick, choking fog. By mid-morning, the plantation's inner courtyard had been transformed into a theater of the macabre. The air hung heavy and stagnant, smelling of nervous sweat, stale tobacco, and the dry, acrid dust kicked up by the carriage wheels of the gathered elite. Neighboring planters stood in tight clusters, their faces masks of skepticism and morbid curiosity, wiping moisture from their brows with linen handkerchiefs. The local sheriff leaned against a hitching post, his hand resting uneasily on his belt, while two reporters from the Richmond Dispatch scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their eyes scanning the perimeter for the source of the rumors that had set the county ablaze. When the heavy oak doors of the storehouse were finally unbarred, the sound of the iron latch lifting echoed like a gunshot across the silent yard. Elijah was dragged into the blinding sunlight by two burly overseers. The weeks of confinement had carved a hollow, skeletal landscape onto his face. His cheekbones protruded sharply beneath skin that had taken on the ashen hue of spent charcoal. Yet, it was his eyes that arrested the crowd. They were not the eyes of a broken child, but burned with a terrifying, lucid intensity, staring not at the people before him, but through them, fixed on a horizon no one else could perceive. He moved with a disjointed, puppet-like gait, his bare feet dragging through the red Virginia clay, leaving trails that looked disturbingly like script. Reverend Elijah Albright stood at the center of the yard, a granite monolith in his black frock coat, clutching a leather-bound Bible that seemed too small for his massive hands. His voice, practiced in the pulpit, boomed across the plantation, reciting verses of deliverance that seemed to wither in the oppressive heat. With theatrical solemnity, he raised a silver crucifix, the metal glinting sharply in the sun, and stepped toward the boy. The crowd held its collective breath, the only sound the rustle of wind through the nearby cornstalks. As the cold metal of the cross pressed against Elijah's feverish forehead, the boy did not recoil or shriek as the Reverend had promised. Instead, his strings seemed to cut. He collapsed to his knees with a heavy thud, his body going rigid not in seizure, but in sudden, terrifying focus. His hands, tipped with nails broken and blackened from scratching at stone walls, struck the earth. He began to draw. It was a frenzy of motion, a blur of dust and desperation. The sound of his fingers tearing into the dry ground was a rhythmic, scratching cadence that set teeth on edge. He did not draw the fantastical flying machines of his youth. This time, he carved infrastructure. Long, straight lines cut north, intersecting with jagged webs that the reporters realized, with a jolt of recognition, resembled the new telegraph networks and railroad lines, the arteries of industrial warfare. Then, his movements became frantic, circular, violent. He cleared a wide space in the dirt and began to sculpt a topography of slaughter. He raised mounds of earth to represent hills, carved a deep, winding snake for a creek, and used his own saliva mixed with the red clay to paint thick, muddy streaks across a sunken road. It was a map of the Battle of Antietam, a conflict that would not drown the soil in blood for another year. He marked the positions of artillery with pebbles and used twigs to represent thousands of fallen bodies in a cornfield that did not yet exist. A veteran reporter from the Dispatch, a man named Holloway, who knew the geography of Maryland intimately, stepped forward, his cynicism evaporating into cold dread. He recognized the curvature of the creek, the specific layout of the town of Sharpsburg. As Elijah slumped forward, his energy spent, his hand resting on the muddy representation of the future, Bloody Lane, Holloway whispered, "Dear God, that is the topography of a graveyard." The silence that descended upon Mulberry Creek was absolute, heavier than the heat, as the witnesses stared at the dirt, unknowingly looking into the open mouth of their own destruction. The silence that followed Elijah's collapse was not the quiet of peace, but the suffocating vacuum that precedes a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, the dust motes dancing in the Virginia heat seemed to freeze above the sprawling, impossible map etched into the hard-packed earth. Then, the spell broke, shattered by the guttural roar of Silas Thorne. His face, usually flushed with the arrogance of the landed gentry, had drained to the color of old parchment, his hands trembling violently as they gripped the silver head of his cane. The air, thick with the scent of horse sweat, heated pine, and sweet tobacco, suddenly reeked of panic. "Cover it!" Thorne screamed, his voice cracking, losing its polished cadence. "Cover it all! Now!" The overseers, men accustomed to the slow, measured rhythm of field labor, moved with a frantic, jerky haste. Iron shovels bit into the ground, scraping against hidden stones with a sound like gnashing teeth. They scooped heavy mounds of red clay and gray sand, flinging it over the intricate lines of the railway networks and the terrifying topography of the future battlefield. The dust rose in choking clouds, coating the throats of the onlookers, tasting of copper and dry earth. It was a burial. They were not just hiding drawings. They were attempting to suffocate a truth that had terrified them to their marrow. The reporters from the Richmond Dispatch, initially eager for a story of primitive madness, were corralled by Thorne's armed patrollers, men with hard eyes and hands hovering near their holsters. Words were exchanged, sharp, low threats about libel laws and the safety of one's journey home, effectively sealing the lips of the press with the heavy wax of intimidation. In the center of this swirling chaos, Clara had fallen to the ground beside her son. She gathered Elijah into her arms, indifferent to the dirt staining her apron or the shouting men. Elijah was dead weight against her chest, his body radiating a feverish heat that seemed to burn through her rough cotton dress. His eyes were open, fixed on a point in the sky that no one else could see. The pupils dilated so wide they swallowed the iris. He did not blink. He did not breathe in rhythm. He was a husk, his spirit seemingly pulled taut across the fabric of time, anchored somewhere in the bloody cornfields of Maryland, a year hence. Clara rocked him, humming a low, wordless melody that vibrated in her throat, a desperate lullaby trying to call him back from the edge of the abyss. "Take him back," Thorne ordered, pointing his cane at the boy not as a human, but as a cursed object. "And make sure he stays there." They dragged Elijah from his mother's grasp. The separation was not violent, for Elijah offered no resistance. He was as pliable as a rag doll. But the cruelty lay in the destination. They did not merely return him to the damp storage shed. Thorne ordered the plantation carpenter to bring thick oak planks and long iron nails. The heavy thud of the hammer striking wood began to echo across Mulberry Creek, a rhythmic, hollow sound that mimicked the beating of a dying heart. Wham! 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 The sound carried over the tobacco fields, reaching the ears of every enslaved person, a grim Morse code signaling the end of hope. They were not just locking a door, they were sealing a tomb. The single window was bricked over, blocking out the sun, leaving the boy in absolute, suffocating darkness. The air inside would soon grow stale, heavy with the smell of damp wood and despair. Outside, Dr. Alistair Finch watched the final plank being driven home. He did not intervene. His scientific curiosity had curdled into a primal nausea. Clutching his sketchbook to his chest, the leather cover slick with his own cold sweat, he signaled his driver. As his carriage rattled away down the gravel drive, kicking up dust that settled on the waxy leaves of the magnolia trees, Finch looked back only once. The plantation house stood grand and white, but the shed in its shadow felt like a festering wound on the landscape. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was leaving a boy to rot in the dark, but the secrets in his notebook burned against his ribs, a burden he would carry to his grave. The prophet was silenced, buried beneath wood and earth, but the lines he had drawn in the dirt remained burned into the minds of those who had seen them, indelible scars that no amount of sand could ever truly scour away. The fluorescent lights of the Virginia Historical Society hummed with a low electric drone, a stark contrast to the silence of the history sleeping in the archival boxes below. It was 1978, more than a century since the cannons fell silent at Appomattox, and the world had moved on, burying the strange and the unexplained under layers of industrial progress and academic skepticism. In a windowless research room, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a doctoral candidate from the University of Richmond, sat surrounded by the smell of decaying lignin and old leather. She was wearing white cotton gloves, her movements careful and methodical as she sifted through the economic bones of Henrico County. Stacks of mundane ledgers detailing crop yields, tool inventories, and the dehumanizing lists of human property. She was looking for patterns in cotton pricing, but the archive had a different story to tell that afternoon. Buried at the bottom of a mislabeled box, beneath a stack of water-damaged invoices from the Mulberry Creek plantation, her fingers brushed against something that felt wrong. It was a small journal, bound in black leather that had cracked like parched earth over the decades. Unlike the clean, bureaucratic ledgers of the plantation overseers, this book felt chaotic. The binding was warped, stained with moisture that might have been rain or sweat, and it carried a faint, lingering scent of medicinal alcohol and mold. When Evelyn opened the cover, the spine cracked with a sound like a dry twig snapping in a winter forest. The pages were brittle, yellowed to the color of old ivory, and covered in a handwriting that wasn't the steady script of a bookkeeper, but the jagged, frantic scrawl of a man writing by the light of a dying candle. It was the diary of Dr. Alistair Finch. There were no dates, only the rushed outpourings of a mind grappling with the impossible. Evelyn leaned in, squinting at the faded brown ink. The text was interspersed with sketches that made her pause, her breath catching in the quiet room. These were not the crude doodles of a bored physician. They were technical schematics. On one page, she found a drawing of a rotary blade system encased in a housing that looked undeniably like a modern jet turbine, yet the caption described it as a wind screw for the carriage of the clouds. On another, a complex arrangement of coils and glass bulbs mirrored the internal architecture of a vacuum tube radio, technology that would not exist for another 40 years after the diary was written. Evelyn felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck. The air in the archive suddenly felt heavy, charged with the weight of a secret that had been waiting in the dark. She turned the page and found the most disturbing entry of all. Finch described a scene of horror in the dirt of a plantation courtyard, a map drawn in blood and mud by a silent boy, depicting the topography of Sharpsburg, Maryland. The doctor's writing here was erratic, the pen tearing through the paper in places. He detailed the positioning of troops, the sunken road, the cornfield, details of the Battle of Antietam, written a full year before the first shot was fired. Tucked between the pages was a clipping from the Richmond Dispatch, dated 1862. The newsprint was so fragile it was nearly transparent. It contained a brief, dismissive report about a disturbance of superstition at the Thorne estate, warning readers against the hysteria of the Negro quarters. It was a cover-up, a deliberate erasure of a prophecy too dangerous to acknowledge. Sitting alone in that sterile room, Evelyn realized she was holding the only surviving evidence of a fracture in time, a testament to a boy whose mind had been a doorway to a future he was never meant to see. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, headache-inducing drone, the only sound in the cavernous reading room of the Virginia Historical Society. It was late autumn, 1978. Dr. Evelyn Reed sat surrounded by towers of gray archival boxes, her white cotton gloves stained with the dust of a century. The air here was dry, conditioned to preserve the decaying cellulose of the past. Yet to Evelyn, it carried the faint, sweet scent of old tobacco and iron gall ink, the aroma of secrets refusing to rot. She had spent weeks navigating the labyrinth of the Thorne family ledgers, searching for the final chapter of The Boy Who Saw Tomorrow. But the plantation records offered only a bureaucratic void. In the ledger for the fiscal year of 1862, where the inventory of human property was meticulously tallied, in elegant cursive, Elijah's name was absent. It was not merely omitted. The paper itself bore the roughness of an erasure, as if someone had frantically scraped the ink away until the fiber thinned. Below that jagged gap, a single devastating entry remained. Clara, female, age 34, sold. Savannah Market, November 1861. The finality of the text struck Dr. Reed like a physical blow. The mother who had shielded the boy's impossible gift had been stripped away, sent south to the cotton hills of Georgia, likely dying without ever knowing the fate of the son she left behind those boarded doors. Evelyn turned her attention to the last artifact on her desk, the leather-bound diary of Dr. Alistair Finch. The cover was brittle, flaking like dried mud under her gloved fingertips. She turned to the final page, where the doctor's handwriting, usually precise and clinical, devolved into erratic, terrified scrawls. There, occupying the center of the page, was a diagram Finch had labeled the seer's mark. It was a complex, geometric figure, a lattice of interlocking circles and sharp, triangular vectors that seemed to vibrate even as they lay static on the yellowed paper. It was a perfect match for the description of the lines on Elijah's palms, whispered about by the plantation midwife decades prior. As Evelyn traced the pattern with her finger, hovering just millimeters above the page, the atmosphere in the archive shifted violently. The hum of the ventilation system cut out, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against her eardrums. The overhead lights flickered once, then died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. A sudden, unnatural cold swept through the aisles, smelling not of the library's dust, but of ozone, wet earth, and the metallic tang of a thunderstorm. It was the smell of the air before a lightning strike. Evelyn sat frozen, her breath hitching in her throat, feeling a gaze fixed upon her from the shadows, not malicious, but intensely observant, timeless and vast. As quickly as it had vanished, the light returned with a sharp snap. The temperature remained frigid, raising gooseflesh on her arms. Her eyes darted to her notepad, where a clean white index card she used as a bookmark lay on top of the diary. It was no longer blank. There, rendered in a faint, impossible dust that looked like charcoal, was a fragment of a new schematic. It did not belong to the 19th century, nor even the 1970s. The drawing resembled the logic gates of a quantum processor or a wireless energy node, technology that would not be conceptualized for another 40 years. Dr. Reed sat paralyzed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The charcoal dust was loose, fresh, smudging slightly in the draft of the restarting air conditioner. Was this a hallucination born of fatigue, or had she inadvertently completed a circuit that spanned a century? Did Elijah die in that dark shed at Mulberry Creek, or did his consciousness simply transcend the linear prison of time, leaving breadcrumbs for a future that could finally understand him? The ledger is closed, but the blueprint remains unfinished. We are left with the chilling possibility that the boy's mind is still active, projecting his visions onto the canvas of our reality, waiting for us to catch up. If you believe that some histories are too powerful to be buried, subscribe to our channel and share this video. Look closely at the technology around you. Perhaps you are holding something Elijah sketched in the dirt long before it was born.